Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
The stuff that dreams are made of.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
You're tearing me apart! He's looking at you, kid.
Well, nobody's perfect.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Hello and welcome to Revisiting the Golden Age, a journey through classic Hollywood, podcast brought to you by the Inside the Film Room Podcast Network. I'm your host, Josh Martin, and this is episode 2, so welcome back. If you enjoyed our first episode on Duck Soup, glad you're back for another episode. I'm very excited today to welcome Inside the Film Room co-founder, Jake Lawler. Jake, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me, Josh.
I am very excited to talk about our film for today, which I believe you just watched. And it's an interesting film from 1932, directed by Tod Browning and produced by MGM. This is Freaks. Tod Browning is a filmmaker. Probably his most famous film is Dracula with Bela Lugosi from 1931. But Freaks is another big one. And so this was both of our first time watching this movie. Jake, what did you think?
Because we were texting each other periodically while I was watching it. I was shocked by how well it held up. It was, I think, like we talked about, it was surprisingly progressive. I mean, it's just like there wasn't ever a sense of tokenism. There wasn't any ever a sense of spectacle with the people that were represented on the screen. They were just there. I mean, it was just them living their lives, and it was like a picturesque. It was a picturesque example of like just people living their lives in situations that we don't normally see, and then all of that enveloped in a very rather well executed money grab plot. And I think that I was shocked by how well it held up, because 1932, I was like, well, this is going to be a 1932 movie. And honestly, I think that, of course, with touching up, with coloring and all these different things, I think that movie could have came out a couple of years ago and still been as impactful as it is now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so you're right. You hear a film from 1932. The title is Freaks. It features mostly performers with disabilities, and you go, okay, is this going to necessarily be up to the standards that we would hold today? And apart from possibly a few elements that, whether I would say problematic or not, certainly are worth nuanced discussion. It's definitely a film that I would say holds up as a sort of extremely progressive motion picture for the period that it was in, for the genre that it was in. And yeah, so I was very impressed with it. And so for those who don't know the story of the film, I'll give a quick synopsis real quick. So Freaks, we were talking about this too in our text back and forth. It is sort of a film that predates many of the conventions of film noir, which is a genre that more, I would say, even though you see it in sort of German expressionist film and a lot of other movies throughout the 1930s, really emerges during the period of World War II and post-war. But really, this plot is boilerplate noir. It follows a sort of circus of performers, most of whom are differently abled or have disabilities. And so there's all sorts of subplots, which is really interesting. I think you touched on this a little bit too, and I think it's absolutely correct. It is sort of this, observational film at the same time that it's a narrative film too. We get sort of images of the different characters, sort of like you said, just going about their lives, and that's really powerful stuff. The main plot follows Hans and Frida are the two characters who are at the center of the narrative, and they're sort of part of this circus. A new performer comes in at a certain point named Cleopatra, and we talked about Cleopatra in our group chats a little bit. One of probably the most sort of straight up, like, despicable characters I can imagine. I mean, really. So she quickly realizes that Hans has a bit of a crush on her, eventually quickly realizes that Hans is also extremely wealthy. And so she sort of creates this scheme where her and Hans will get married and they'll be happy, and everything will be great. Unfortunately, that does not quite, things don't quite go as planned for her. She is the sort of unqualified villain of the film, partially for how she's exploiting Hans, and partially because she has this very strong disdain for what she would probably call the freaks, or the characters that make up this sort of community of outcasts in the film. I didn't fully realize this when I was watching this, so this was like a really delightful surprise for me. Did you know that this was where the one of us chant comes from? I don't know if that was just, I had no idea. I was like, oh my gosh, this is, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was like, I had no idea. And then hearing it just like you, I was so surprised. I mean, I think that there's a lot of this film that really, I think, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, that predates a lot of different things, and it's so well executed. And I think one of, like, that chant is sort of serves as a microcosm for the larger point that we're getting at.
Yeah. No, and so that's a scene near the end of the film. It's at, and so I mentioned this in the previous podcast. I'll probably do this in a few more disclaimers, but these are all like spoiler-filled podcasts. Like I said on the last one, these movies are like 90 years old, anywhere from 90 to 50 years old. I'm spoiling away. So so Hans and Cleopatra do end up getting married. They have a big wedding, and at the ceremony, or after the ceremony, they try to induct Cleopatra into the sort of their community of performers. It's an interesting film in that we never, and this goes directly to what you mentioned about the fact that in the film, disability is never aestheticized. It's never turned into a spectacle, in part because we never see them performing. We never see really the circus performances. We never see crowds. We never see, with one exception, which we'll get to at some point, too many people leering at characters with disabilities. But they try to induct Cleopatra at this wedding ceremony into their community, and she totally like freaks out. Like, she's clearly terrified of all of them, and it's this sort of remarkable moment, probably the most memorable in the film. And so, yeah, you get this, and the plot, it's really interesting because I mentioned this sort of film noir influence before. The plot almost directly recalls a film from about 13 years later. It's called Scarlet Street. It's a Fritz Lang noir film, and it's very similar. It's like, there's sort of the disability component is notably absent, which it can't be discounted. Obviously, it's not a one-to-one comparison, but it's like an Edward G. Robinson film, and he's this sort of guy who gets seduced by this woman who clearly thinks very little of him, and she's, sort of extorting him for his money, and it goes down, and she's got a boyfriend herself, goes down a very dark path eventually, but it's a very similar film. This one goes down a different path, and the ending, I wouldn't say it's uplifting, but it certainly is cathartic in a way. And I was curious what you thought about sort of some of the directions that this film goes.
Yeah, I mean, well, what I found fascinating is, like, I think for the first half hour, it feels sort of meandering, not in a bad way at all. I mean, it's cool. Like, I think the direction is sharp, and I think it's so pleasant to see a film with differently abled people in it that aren't, like we said, that aren't made a spectacle out of. I mean, it's just like to see these group of performers, to see them laugh and to see them have like dense, like nuanced lives, and like real relationships, connective relationships that we can see pop on screen, is great. And then, but it for the first 30 minutes, it just feels like a tour. It feels like there's a little bit of signposting here and there with the Cleo Hans relationship and the sort of devolution of Hans and Frida's relationship. But it's not until Frida reveals reveals Hans' fortune to Cleo where it really starts centering its focus. And I think that I thought that worked really well. I mean, because it allowed you to sort of relax and be enveloped in a world that not many people are very kind of acclimated to, and then to juxtapose that, and especially like with the kindness of Froso and like Froso and being in a relationship and being able to see all of these different things, but then to like juxtapose all of that with the sort of nefariousness of Hercules and Cleo. I think it allowed me to feel a lot more invested in what was going on, because I've seen these people laugh, I've seen them smile, I've seen them as who they are as people. And then to be able to understand the circumstances surrounding someone that wants to take advantage of one of their friends, I think it made all the difference for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned Frozo and some of the other. So not all of the characters in the film are played by, a lot of the characters with disabilities are played by non-professional actors. But there are some sort of able-bodied performers in the film, and their role is very crucial, as you mentioned, because they provide this essential counterpoint to Cleo and Hercules, who are these really conniving characters with nothing but ill will for this community that they happen to be a part of. And so to see Frozo and some of the other characters treat this community with kindness and grace, it is really moving. The film does take a turn into sort of more, I would say, more straightforward genre elements at a certain point. But you're right, it is a very sort of meandering observational drama for a while, in which we get to watch these daily lives, and we get to watch people interact, and a lot of the interactions are funny or moving or romantic. And yeah, I mean, I was really impressed by that, which I think makes the sort of turn into film noir conventions, and in many cases, the conventions of the horror film, much more interesting, potentially problematic in spots, but I don't quite think it's as problematic as it could have been in certain areas. I guess I'll move into talking about the framing device a little bit, because that's a key part of the movie. We open, and it's not clear what we're looking at this point, but we open with a museum tour guide of some sorts taking a group of tourists around, and you don't see what's in the pit, but it's clear that someone has been turned into a quote unquote freak of sorts. And we're led to infer at a certain point that someone did something to her, and we're led to believe that that's Cleopatra. So it's not really a surprise where the narrative goes, but there is a certain anticipation in waiting for one of the images that closes out the film, which sort of reveals what the community at the circus ended up doing to Cleopatra, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think to your point, what it really felt like to me, it felt like Sunset Boulevard.
Yes.
Because I think to your point, it's about the anticipation. And in Sunset Boulevard, we know what happens from the first 5 minutes, but we know point A and we know point B, but we don't know how they got to where they're headed. And I think that this film does a really good job of almost making you forget that there is a framing device. Because I as you're moving forward, I think that only works because of the sort of meandering element of the first half hour, when like it's so not explicitly focused on the movement, or like the movement of the plot, or the movement of the story, or the movement of the noir conventions as we get later into it. I think being like basically hanging out at the circus for a day like allows you to sort of relax and kind of forget what's happening. And then when it starts to get more frightening and more violent, I think it ushers back in that sense of what happened to Cleo, because like you said, it's the instant moment. Like as soon as I forgot the tour guide is saying something about like she was so beautiful, and then the transition is instantly to Cleo.
Yeah.
But I think it does a really good job of making you almost forget that it's there.
No, absolutely. And I think I'm glad you mentioned this sort of like hangout vibe of the movie, the sort of fact that we get to hang out a day at the circus. And that's a concept that I've explored in a number of venues. And I think it's a really fruitful one here because, especially in the context of its sort of progressive elements, it is sort of an interesting way to just sort of experience the quotidian day-to-day tasks that these characters experience. And it does make the sort of, it does firmly set up our allegiances as we move into that final stretch of time where it does sort of pivot into more narrative focus. And I agree, the framing device, it's there, but it's so brief at the beginning, and then it pops back up so briefly at the end that it really is sort of a minor part of the film.
Yeah, and I because I love the Twilight Zone, the original series. Yeah. I've seen many episodes of it, and a lot of this, being that it predates it, I think that a lot of the elements in here, Rod Serling must have been either directly or indirectly influenced, because there's the air of, especially towards like once we pass that half-hour mark, there is, and it honestly, it feels there were a lot of moments because I watched Night of the Hunter for the first time over summer, and there were a lot of moments where when we talk about the progressiveness or we talk about the dialogue, which feels very modern, and their interactions feel very organic, I had to pause it, and I was like, am I sure that this came out in 1932? Yeah. Because like it just stands the test of time so well. But I do think that there's a lot of really good elements in here, and I think like what we're building up to is that when it does pass that half-hour mark, I think that what allows it to be so successful is, I think, like a beautiful marriage of both the narrative structure, what they've been building, and this really stellar technical elements as well. I mean, there's, like we talked about before, there's a surprising amount of really well-performed camera movement.
Yeah.
And there's some really, really expert moments of lighting in here, and lighting choice. And I think that all of that just allows the film to sort of flourish and thrive in the last half hour when it starts to get more dark.
Yeah, no, definitely some of the stuff you're talking about with the camera movement and lighting. I'm thinking particularly, so the film, we've sort of hinted at this from the narrative standpoint. The film eventually pivots, and we get a sequence where Cleo and Hercules essentially poison Hans. Their point is to basically slowly poison him to death over a period of time, at which point she'll inherit his fortune. And so we get that, and eventually the group is heading on the road, and we learn that at a certain point, for the first half of the film, Hans is a deeply likable and sympathetic character, but we also sort of have a certain assumption of him that he's so sort of in love with Cleo that he can't see what she's really doing to him, and that he's so sort of enamored. Mm-hmm. And eventually it becomes clear that he very much knows what she's doing. Yeah. She's been giving him medicine every day, and he's pushing it to the side. And so we get this incredible scene where basically the other performers help Hans and Frida and everybody sort of escape and get back to normal and take out Hercules and Cleo. And I'm thinking of all those things you talked about with the sort of lighting and the camera movement, but also just sort of the sound design, and then also the framing. So throughout that whole sequence, we have this rain, and it's this wonderfully ominous sequence where the character's gaze becomes really threatening. We have all these sort of characters who are typically marginalized, typically looked over or laughed at, especially by Cleo and Hercules. I'm not sure if we talked much about who Hercules is yet. That's Cleo's boyfriend. He's like a strong man of sorts, incredibly despicable character. Anyways, but you get all these images of the other characters staring at them, and it verges. You're watching that at first, and you go, okay, is this sort of turning these characters and their sort of their different bodies and their different their disabilities, is it turning them into something horrific? But it really isn't. And that's what's so remarkable about it, is that these are characters that Cleo and Hercules have looked over the whole time, have said, we can manipulate these people and take advantage of them. And all of a sudden their look and their power and their gaze becomes intensely threatening and frightening to them. And it's so delightful to watch. I mean, as delightful as basically a double murder can be. I always feel somewhat weird talking about in those terms. However, it's clearly what the film wants us to hear and feel. And so, I was really impressed with how carefully the film walked the line between, aestheticizing and turning, characters with disabilities into monstrous figures, or as the title says, freaks, which almost the title, like I said at the start, it's something I go, ooh, that might be problematic. And then you watch it and the title is almost ironic. I wonder if it was, it positions a certain state of mind that the film, works carefully and tirelessly to reject and counter, which I thought was so fascinating.
Well, I think that that's such an excellent point. I guess kind of like my addition to that is twofold. I mean, to talk about the title, I think that the title sort of is inexorably linked towards what you were talking about when all these people that Hercules and Cleo have looked down upon. It's a power dynamic switch.
Yeah.
I think it truly is, and I think that naming it freaks and then watching what's happening, I think it takes the power of that word away, and I think it redistributes that power to those who are named or like are called rather wrongly freaks by Hercules and Cleo. And to your earlier point where you're talking about the problematic nature of it, when I first, because I just came off of watching it, and when I was watching it, when they were basically they were all crawling to kill Hercules.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know how this is like kind of problematic, but I think the more that we talk about it, I'm not as sure that it is, because I feel like it literally is a power dynamic switch where they are bringing these people down to their level.
Yeah.
And I think by doing that, it allows them to, like you said, I mean, their gaze becomes powerful, their movements become powerful. Everything that they do is that they have taken the power from these people that have thought them for the entire film to be powerless. And, obviously I think that if the film was made now, there would have been more creative choices. But I think like within the context of 1932 and what they did, I think it really was rather progressive and liberating in a sense, I'm sure, for hopefully, I'm sure that for all the actors involved. That they were allowed to be who they were freely, and then conversely be able to, like you said, make it a cathartic experience towards the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I had a very, very similar experience to you, where I'm watching it and I'm going, okay, we worked the first 30 minutes of the film to make these characters really likable, and then now all of a sudden they're like murdering people. But I think, the more we've talked about it, the more I've thought about it, it's very clear that that sort of, like you mentioned, that redistribution of power, it is powerful and it is sort of cathartic to watch. And it is a rather shrewd move on Browning's part to take that sort of traditionally exploitative structure and reverse it.
Yeah. When Hercules is murdered and Cleo is maimed and literally made into a chicken.
Yeah.
Which is just like, I'm sure, I mean, even now that was unnerving to watch, even considering how hateful and spiteful that she was. But I think the film does a really good job of making you reckon with what you just watched, because when they cut to Hans after Cleo's new form, new body is revealed, Hans seems rather regretful that it took that turn, because I think explicitly he says, all I wanted was the poison bottle. And I don't think that he ever intended for her to end up that way. And this film, I think in large part is about consequence. I think it's about the consequences of Hercules and Cleo, and how greedy they are and the consequences of that. And then it's about the consequences of the actions that you take to right those wrongs.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think that if there was an element that is really conventionally problematic by today's standards, it would be sort of the what you call the maiming of Cleo. I absolutely agree, because I think And I do think that there is sort of a sense of regret in the film, and it certainly falls into the trope of the femme fatale, this sort of, woman who must be punished, who's deceptive and tricks characters, and who has to be killed, this sort of pulling out this sort of sexist trope. In this case, it's a character who's so overtly unlikable, and and is this sort of central focus of the film's narrative, the person who is exploiting Hans and who is really going after his money. Hercules, who also gets killed, is sort of an accessory to this. But it is very notable that as problematic as it may be, the only truly aestheticized and image that becomes a spectacle of sort of disability, or to riff on the title, this freakishness, is Cleo at the end, when we see her in this callback to the beginning, and we see her in the pit, and she's been made into a chicken or a duck or whatever, and it's incredibly disturbing, and I think the film plays with a complex mix of emotions there. On the one hand, we're like, oh, this is extremely icky, and potentially sort of retrograde. But also, maybe this character in this case, I hesitate to say deserved it, but in the case of this narrative, it becomes this sort of push and pull inside us, which is this thing that the unique power of cinema to make us sort of want to see things happen to horrible characters that in real life we would hesitate to ever mention.
Yeah, and I think to your point there, I think that all of this is sort of framed up within the kindness of Froso.
Yeah.
And how like truly nice he is. Like when he was speaking with that one young woman about her dress.
Oh, such a good
that
scene.
Was like a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful moment.
Yeah.
One of the more powerful and poignant moments I've probably ever seen in a movie. To be able, like, and especially when you contextualize it being in 1932, being like a straight white male character, to be able to say those things to someone that is differently abled, and it's not out of like anything other than sincerity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's you can tell that he is radiating kindness because he cares about these people.
Yeah.
And I think that if this film was framed in a different way, where everyone was sort of like, if it really was freaks, if it really was everyone was sort of against these people, everyone was sort of against this cast of characters that have been brought before us, it would have cheapened the rather like completely vile nature of Cleo, I think, because she would have just been another one of the bunch. But like to have these real true moments of kindness and sincerity, and then to be able to place that right next to Cleo and Hercules' vile nature, I think it's exactly what you're saying. I think that it almost is a sense where you want bad things to happen to bad people because you've seen good people and you've seen the goodness that what good people can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit it on the head. It's such a generous film, and there is a sense when I was watching it, I was going, there's Froso, who's this just wonderful, generous character, and there's another. He has this sort of love interest plot that happens throughout the film, and she's Frida's confidant at certain points, and sort of working with her to sort of against Cleo. And these two characters have a romance, and you go in there and you go, okay, maybe this is, in the context of the film, perhaps a ploy to an audience that, trying to get people into the theater. I was browsing just a cursory search at the Wikipedia page, and we were talking about this a little bit before we went on. It was originally closer to 90 minutes, and they cut it down to 64. And part of the reason that was cited was that it was too grotesque for audiences, which I think is an interesting point. And I think it's to the point. The other thing that we've been talking about is, while we are sort of really aligned with the characters in the film and really aligned against Cleo and Hercules, the film does sort of implicate the viewer in society, as I hesitate to ever go to that word, but this sort of social ostrich, Joker just comes immediately to mind, and I can't take it seriously anymore. But this sort of marginalization and ostracization people with disabilities and you know, differently abled, and it's the film does sort of call into question, you know, who viewers, especially in a you know, a 1932 context, and and in a contemporary context, who they'll accept as movie characters and as movie stars. And so at certain points I was like, well, maybe these two characters, these sort of you know, straight white men and women, able-bodied characters, are in the film just to sort of placate a conventional audience. But at the same time, I'm so glad you mentioned that scene with the girl. It is so generous and warm-hearted, and so wonderful. And that, more than the romance between those two characters, is the focus. And I think and you know, you got that one completely right, because it's just such, you know, loving and kind moments for sure.
Yeah, and I think that, to your point about like just about Froso and Venus's relationship, I think that the handling of the female characters throughout the film, and how their narratives are built and how they're built around, of course, I think you're always going to run into sexism when you're dealing with a film from the 30s. Yes. And of course that there is a little, I mean, even initially with Froso's first reaction with Venus, he comes off as rather sexist.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a sort of organic nature to learning what's happening here, because even Venus is a little bit wary of the rest of the circus. And I think by an extension of Froso's kindness, she starts to become more kind to them. And conversely, by an extension of Venus spending more time with Froso, I think he becomes less and less sexist. And I think that by doing that, as well as, like you said so expertly, with implicating the audience, I do think that the audience is meant to be implicated. And I think that, like, even, you know, with the more overt stuff, where we are watching them throughout their daily life, but even more subtly, I mean, going back to the gaze that we were talking about, those gazes were almost directly in the camera.
Yeah.
And I think we are meant to look at them and not only see them as people, but make sure that we question and check our biases and prejudices as well. Because I think that when you do something like that, if you don't do it right, it ends up looking like a UNICEF commercial where you're just like, it completely sort of like cheapens everything. But with this, it's like, it is meant, like, you know, I think Browning did a great job of knowing his audience and knowing that people were going to watch this. And he wanted to make sure that they felt with every fiber of their being, the intent of these characters and the decisions that they made and the repercussions and consequences of those decisions. And I think that it wasn't about hand-holding, but it was about recognizing that this was made for people to see, and he wanted people to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other sort of crucial scenes that we haven't quite mentioned yet is early in the film. We get that framing opening, and then we get a scene where two characters that I don't believe we ever see again, they're just sort of, you know, random people off the street, and they're walking in the woods, and they see some of the members of the circus community, and they're like deeply terrified. They're you know, and this is the first time, I believe this is the first time we've seen any of the characters from the film. And so it is this complex game of viewer alignment, but then it sort of reverses it at the end. So we get this final scene, we see Cleo, and then the guy that's touring people around the museum, like, tries to explain. It's a little bit like the Psycho, like, end of Norman Bates, like, where they try to explain, like, oh, why did this happen? And he, like, proposes this, you know, it's like, maybe it was the code of the freaks. And it's just so off base. It's like, it doesn't really, like, even click. It's like, okay, I mean, yeah, you know, it seems on the surface like perhaps, like, the film is making a definitive statement of, like, oh, well, this is what happens. And in that case, it opens up a more problematic reading. But for the viewer who has seen the film, who has seen Cleo and Hercules's, you know, the depths of which they were going to try to extort, essentially sort of get money out of Hans, and the way that they treated all the other characters, we know that answer is totally insufficient for what the actual cause was. And, you know, And I think that's so interesting, the way that sort of, and we can't, none of us can guarantee that what we're reading into the film is entirely 100% correct. Maybe that was the answer that Browning wanted us to take away. I don't think it quite was, though. And I think this film is really smart in ways that it deserves a lot of credit for.
Yeah. And exactly to your point, it would seem almost utterly and completely detrimental to the entire film if that was supposed to be our takeaway. Because if that were the case, then that dress scene would have never happened. There would have been no need for it. It didn't serve any purpose towards moving the story forward.
Yeah.
There wasn't any reason for it to be there other than for Browning to have spent time with his cast and understand what he wanted us to understand as well. I wonder if Browning had a different vision for this film, and then as he spent time with the people that he was working with, he might have changed it. And I think that I honestly think that could be the case, because now that I'm saying that, I'm thinking that what if, like, the Code of the Freaks was the original dialogue that he had put in there, but since he had changed the conventions of the film, he wanted to keep that in there because people that weren't privy to the experience that he was, or privy to the experience that he gave us by making the film, would have instantly made that suggestion. And I think to leave that in there it's almost accusatory in a sense, and it makes the audience culpable as well. And I think it's about the gaze that we've been talking, and it's about checking those biases. And I think that leaving that in there it's a powerful indictment of what people think when they don't understand other people that aren't them.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think this has been a really interesting and insightful conversation. And it's always so much fun to talk about films that have a lot on their mind and that bring a lot to the table, because like I think we both alluded to at different points, our minds have constantly been changed throughout this discussion. We've thought about different things, even scenes that I thought I had a solid handle on before coming in. I was like, oh, well, maybe something different. So, but yeah, no, I really enjoyed this film, and I thought it, is this really unique document from early film history, a film that is far more progressive and far more interesting and complex and nuanced than I would have imagined going in. And this was a really great discovery to make along this journey through classic Hollywood that I'm taking with this podcast. So, Jake, any final thoughts on Freaks?
No, I think you really alluded to it rather well, and I think you explained it rather well. It's a film that I don't think I would have ever watched without this podcast, so I really appreciate the recommendation. And it's a film that I feel like I'm better because of watching it. So it is remarkably well done. It holds up extremely well. I think I will definitely recommend it to other friends that I know that are interested in this sort of thing, and I recommend it to everybody listening. I do think it's so accessible. It's 64 minutes long.
Yeah.
So I think that you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't check it out.
Yeah. No, I mean, by the time we finish up this podcast here, it'll almost be as long as the film. So I would highly advise checking it out. And well, Jake, thanks for coming on, and to give the viewers a quick sense, you have a new short film that's premiering at FilmFest 919 this month. Any quick thoughts on that for the viewers or the listeners?
Yeah, no, we're really excited to premiere Good Samaritans at FilmFest 919. I think it's so funny to be able, not funny, but it's a really big moment, I think, to be able to start something from a laptop in a few words and sentences and string those together, to be able to shoot it and then edit it and then find a crew that's willing to, be there on the set and then be there post and have someone to score the music and do all these different things. So we're really excited to bring that to FilmFest 919 and then later on for a general release. So keep your eye out for that. And if you are in Chapel Hill, I'd love to see you out there on the 29th when we premiere it.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing that. And I know we'll be having, I don't know if it'll be open to the public or it might just be for UNC students, but I know we'll be having a conversation about that at some point. And so Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on. And I think you'll be back in a few weeks to talk about another early 30s genre classic, King Kong. So I am looking forward to that conversation as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Always good to have one of the co-founders of Inside the Film Room back on the mic. So you can follow Jake on Twitter, and you can follow me on Twitter as well. Twitter and Letterboxd, Martin on Movies. You can find my work at Film Inquiry, as well as a couple articles at Inside the Film Room. In addition, I'm the managing editor, or one of the managing editors of Aspect, UNC's new Journal of Film and Media Studies for undergraduate students. You can find all that information on my Twitter page. Next episode, I'll be joined by Emily Osborne to talk about the 1933 film, The Invisible Man. I'm looking forward to that conversation. In the meantime, hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next time.